To the summary channel, and this video we're going to discuss the most important events that took place during the previous 12 hours. We have lots of very interesting updates, so let's start. And first we're going to talk about Moscow. We have lots of very interesting updates from this area. The ceasefire declared by Putin on the days of the 80th anniversary of the Great Victory has begun. Russia, based on humanitarian considerations, declares a ceasefire from midnight on 7th, 8th until midnight on May 10th, 11th. The fire will cease, but if there is no reciprocity from the Kiev regime and attempts to strike Russian positions or objects continue, then an adequate response will be given immediately. That was stated by the press secretary of Putin, Peskov. So as you can see, the situation is very difficult both for the Russians and for the Ukrainians, but anyway, the Russians decided to increase their security measures. And this video, for example, we can see how the Russians destroyed several drones above the city of Moscow, and this is a very interesting situation because the Russians reported that right before the leaders of different states arrived, the Ukrainians attacked the city of Moscow, and the Russians, almost probably 1 hour before first leaders arrived, were destroying Ukrainian drones above the city of Moscow. This is obviously something crazy. And you know that yesterday and during the previous days we talk a lot about heads of states that were planning to visit Moscow. We're going to see the president of Belarus, the chairman of the People's Republic of China, the president of Serbia, heads of Armenia, Kazakhstan, Azerbaijan, Slovakia, Palestine, Brazil, Kyrgyzstan, Tajikistan, Vietnam, Venezuela, Mongolia, Cuba, Republic Srpska. Lots of people are going to visit Moscow, and this is obviously going to be something huge, and obviously this is something delicious for Ukraine. Anyway, once again, the Russians are planning to, and they have already increased their security measures. According to information we have, the Russians are going to use not just air defense systems like surface to air. The Russians have already started using the helicopters Ka-52 with the purpose to bring down Ukrainian drones. And right before we start making this video, several videos were published by the Russian sources how Russian Ka-52 helicopters were bringing down Ukrainian drones. Furthermore, MiG-35 fighters were used against drones for the first time since the start of the special military operation. So as you can see, security measures are at the highest level. Obviously, the Russians are planning to do everything they can with the purpose not to allow the Ukrainians to harm the leaders and heads of states. For example, in this video, we can see Chinese leader Xi Jinping arrived in Moscow on an official visit that will last until May 11th. Furthermore, we have already different statements made by the president of Serbia. We are talking about Vucic. As you can see, he is already on the Red Square, and he was talking a lot about Russia, about Moscow, and about security measures. So, of course, very interesting situation, very difficult days for the Russian security services. When talking about Ukraine, it's very difficult to understand what is going to happen, what kind of decision the Ukrainians are planning to make during the next days. But one thing we know for sure, that according to several pro-Ukrainian sources, the Ukrainians, not officially, but they accepted this ceasefire and they will follow this ceasefire. At the same time, we got very interesting statement made by Donald Trump. We have reached a point where we will have to make some decision, and I'm not happy about this. So something probably bad are going to happen. Currently, it's very difficult to understand who will be unhappy, the Russians or the Ukrainians, but obviously we're going to find out this very soon. Now let's talk about the situation on the ground, because despite ceasefire, we see that both the Russians and the Ukrainians saved some activities on some direction, but according to sources from the ground, at some directions we can see complete ceasefire and complete silence. So first let's talk about the Kursk direction. According to information we have, there is no ceasefire in this area. There are still very heavy clashes, and today, this morning, pro-Russian resources reported that this morning Ukrainians began another attempt of offensive operation in the direction of the settlement of Tyotkina with the use of significant number of vehicles and infantry fighting vehicles, tanks and infantry. Currently there are very heavy clashes for the settlement of Tyotkina, and most likely we're going to see the situation today, tomorrow, and the day after tomorrow. Furthermore, we continue receiving videos of Ukrainian losses in this area. For example, in this video we can see another Ukrainian vehicle that was heading towards the line of combat contact that was destroyed by a Russian drone. So the situation here remains very difficult. Now let's talk about the Sumy direction. As for this area, we have small adjustments on the map, but according to sources, these adjustments and this additional progress on the ground took place not after the beginning of ceasefire. This is something like results of Russian offensive that took place several days ago. As you can see, according to different sources, the Russians during the previous 48 probably hours managed to improve their positions and to take additional territories under complete control on their way to the village by the name of Loknya. So the Russians continue advancing in this area. Now let's move further and let's discuss the situation in the southern Kupiansk direction. From this area we also have several reports. I'll remind you that yesterday the Minister of Defense of the Russian Federation reported that as a result of clashes, the armed forces of the Russian Federation managed to establish complete control over a small village by the name of Lipovo, which is located to the southwest of the settlement of Nova. And today several neutral mappers adjusted their maps showing additional progress on the ground. According to neutral mappers, the Russians, as a result of offensive operation, managed to improve their positions even further in the western direction and to take under control lots of forests and tree belts. So this is the situation on the ground. And currently the distance between edge Russian positions and the river of Nitrius is already less than 5 kilometers, which is very important for the Russians, because the river of Nitrius is the primary target and task of the armed forces of the Russian Federation in the Liman direction. First they need to get the river, and then they will be able to move both in the southern and in the northern directions. Furthermore, in the Liman direction we have another change on the ground. We have this video that was published by the Russians. In this video we can see how a group of Russian stormtroopers were moving from the settlement of Makeevka in the northwestern direction with the purpose to establish control over another, let's say, stronghold of the armed forces of Ukraine. In this video we can see how the Russians were moving through fields under very heavy fire from Ukrainian side. The Ukrainians, as you can see from this video, were bombing these Russian soldiers even with the cluster rounds, but the Russians managed to, let's say, walk through this area and to get the positions of the armed forces of Ukraine and to take them under complete control. So this video and the moment when the Russians were attacking Ukrainian positions took place exactly in this point. Based on this video we have adjusted the map and we have colored additional territory under complete Russian control. We don't expect that during the ceasefire period we're going to see huge activities of the Russian forces in this area. We believe that this direction will be resumed after the end of the ceasefire, so on the morning of the 11th of May of 2025. Now let's discuss the situation in the Sivas direction. We have lots of important updates. I'll remind you that during the previous days the Russians managed to improve their position significantly, and probably since the end of April the Russians have improved their position significantly, not just in the vicinity of Verkhnekamensk. According to information we have, the Russians managed to take under control around 20% of the settlement of Grigorovka, which is located along the river of Seversky Donets. So these are the changes on the ground, and according to information we have, the Russians during the previous days managed to outflank the settlement of Verkhnekamensk almost completely from the north. As you can see, the Russians haven't improved their positions in the village, but from this configuration we see that around more than 50% of Verkhnekamensk, the village of Verkhnekamensk, is already behind Russian positions. So this information was confirmed by both neutral mappers and by video that was published by the Ukrainians. In this video we can see how units of the 54th Brigade of the armed forces of Ukraine were attacking Russian soldiers that were moving through these fields. This video was published yesterday. We have already discussed this video yesterday. Today we got just additional geolocation that was, let's say, found in this video. So based on this video we have adjusted the map once again. So as you can see, huge progress the Russians shown us during the previous days, and the Russians are about to outflank the settlement of Verkhnekamensk completely, and then most likely the Ukrainians would be forced to fall back. But we don't expect activities from the Russian side during ceasefire period. Most likely the Russians will resume their attempts to attack after the 11th of May. Now let's talk about the Kliban-Bykskaya direction. We have lots of updates. The Russians continue improving their positions in the vicinity of the settlement by the name of Tarasovka. Let's compare the map between the dates. This is the situation, for example, by the end of the 6th, or even earlier, by the end of the 4th of May of 2025. And this is, let's say, the time. This is the moment when the Russians launched their second wave of offensive operation. And now let's take a look how the map has been changed since this moment. So by the beginning of the 8th of May, the Russians improved their positions in the direction of the, let's say, central part of this Kliban-Byksky pocket. According to information we have, the Russians established complete control over the village of Alexandropol. Today, this information was also confirmed by pro-Ukrainian sources Deep State. Most likely today, the Minister of Defense of the Russian Federation will update us with this and will show some videos with Russian flags. Furthermore, according to information we have, the Russians continue advancing deep inside of this pocket in the northeastern direction from the settlement of Novalenovka. This is very important because the Russians most likely will face no resistance from the Ukrainian side, and most likely during using this route of attack, the Russians almost without any resistance from the Ukrainian side will be able to take under control everything inside of this red line. So this is very important because this will allow the Russians to get closer to the main supply lines. Obviously, not now, not tomorrow, not the day after tomorrow, but in 2 weeks we're going to see another cauldron, Kliban-Byksky cauldron, or something similar that we used to see in the South Donetsk direction. The city of Pokrovsk is under very heavy fire. The Russians published another video how they managed to discover the temporary deployment point of FPV drone operators of the armed forces of Ukraine in the southeastern part of the settlement, and then the Russians destroyed and reduced this territory, as you can see, to ruins. As a result of attack, there was a secondary detonation. As you can see, a small warehouse also was destroyed. So as for the situation on the ground, the Russians are not moving, but almost every single day we are receiving more and more videos of how the Russians bomb this area with FABs. It seems that the Russians are trying to prepare this foothold before further offensive operation. Very interesting details are coming from the settlement of Novopavlovka. The Russians are about to finish the battle for this area. Once again, we can see dynamic in this area, the similar that we can see dynamic in the Kliban-Byksky direction. Almost every single day we have changes on the ground, and this is how the map has been changed since the beginning of May. Lots of territories have been taken, as you can see, and the Russians already answered the village of Troitska. This information was confirmed both by neutral and by pro-Russian resources. Furthermore, according to information we have, the Russians managed to answer the settlement of Orekhova from the east, and according to neutral mappers, the Russians managed to answer the same settlement from the north. As for this area, we believe that the Russians will save their pressure despite ceasefire. Furthermore, we have reports that Russian DRG entered Dnipropetrovsk Oblast in the last hours. This information was provided by very reliable neutral resources. Maybe today the Minister of Defense of the Russian Federation will also publish video where we would see the Russian soldiers on the territory of the Dnipropetrovsk Oblast, which is going to be obviously huge media victory for the Russians. But as for now, the Russians are trying to establish complete control over these two last settlements before the border between the regions. As for the Bogatyr direction, no changes. The Russians continue bombing and attacking Ukrainian positions in this village, but as you can see, without any changes on the ground. There are very difficult positions, and the most important that Ukrainians have strong control over this territory. And as for the South Donetsk direction in the vicinity of Novopol and Zeleno-Polye, the Russians during the previous 24 hours managed to improve their positions once again. This is probably the third direction where the Russians are saving their tempo, they're saving their, let's say, momentum. During the previous 24 hours, the Russians improved their positions once again, and currently, according to these adjustments, the distance between Russian positions and the villages of Zeleno-Polye and Novopol is already less than 1 kilometer. As for this area, we believe that the Russians will save their activities and they will continue offensive operation, because if the Russians stop, Ukrainians will have all chances to attack and destroy Russian units in the fields with FPV drones and artillery, which will force the Russians to fall back and to lose their progress on the ground. So the only way to save their progress on the ground is to continue offensive operation with the purpose to answer both villages and to establish some probably protection and secure zone that will allow the Russians to consume